Thank you, Atnafu, for joining us to discuss your work. We're going to discuss two of your papers, the Zeno's Paradox for Low Resource Languages and InkubaML. Can you talk to us a little bit before we get into either of those papers? Can you just tell us a little bit about your journey into machine learning, how you got where you are?
Okay, thank you so much first, Alex, for inviting me to discuss about our paper, and I'm glad to be here. I started working on this space starting from my master's study. So I did my master's in Walaita Soto, and during my master's, I took a class of AI and machine learning. And before that, I don't know anything about machine learning or NLP, and even I don't know like anything about research because in bachelor we don't have research related things in our project. It's just a project-based work. So when I start my master's, I start reading papers, publications, and also after taking this AI and machine learning course, I'm interested mainly on NLP side than other computer vision and other areas because I believe NLP is most related to natural language processing and it's mainly focused on how we can teach machines the language that human beings use, right? So, and as you know, there are a lot of languages in this world, and I think as I grow up, I'm from Ethiopia. I believe that at that time also there are not a lot of languages well known that are spoken in Ethiopia are very represented in digital space. So that was kind of my motivation. And during my master's study, I started doing NLP research, especially related to large languages. And mainly my master's thesis focused on machine translation, specifically for language that are spoken in the southern part of Ethiopia. And that's how I started doing research and reading a lot of papers related to low resource in general, as well as different NLP applications like machine translation and etc.
Great. So moving into the Zeno's paradox of low resource languages. In this paper, you're kind of defining a problem space, which is low resource languages has sort of an elusive definition in this space, which leads to these kind of other problems. Tell us a little bit about the motivation for this work particularly.
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is actually our recent work with the collaboration of Elena from UC Berkeley and from professors from MBZ as well as from Real Lab of University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. So the motivation mainly, as I said, I started working on low resource for a couple of years now. And mostly the way people define lower resource language is mainly biased in our perspective when we say bias or overlook it, because people use just the word to define different things. And most of the low resource papers that are published are mainly uses one paper that's published back then around 2020 by Joshi and al. As a reference to define a language as a low resource. And when we go back to that paper mainly classifies a word language into 5 groups based on the availability of data, basically both monolingual as well as parallel data. But our intention is in this paper mainly we want to know how people define or size one language as a lower resource. And we don't think defining a language based on only data availability is not the right way to do so. So we wanted to investigate or explore when people work on low resource language, why they said language X is a low resource. So that is the motivation. And we believe that the definition currently most of the people using as a reference from the publication from Josh and the Italian paper is not the general or unified kind of definition to name a language as a low resource because of the data, because there are, I don't know if you got a chance to check our paper, but we try to list a lot of other factors that contribute to low resourcedness, not only just data. But so we mainly wanted to see what is the factor or what is the criteria to define one language as a low resource or not. I believe that would be very helpful for the community or for the researchers and for other people who are interested in working on low resource languages to fill a gap, not only by like collecting data, but also by helping the community in different means to try to bring those languages that are left behind from the current development of AI technology or in general technology. Yeah.
You outline four categories that maybe should be considered, or that should be considered when you're discussing or defining a language as low resource. We're going to get into that, but I had to Google the Zeno's paradox. So tell me a little bit about how you're applying the Zeno's paradox to low versus high resource languages. Like, what's the analogy there?
Yeah, so the Zeno's paradox is a very well-known paradox that is written by Zeno, a philosopher from Greek, right? So it's the paradox is basically putting Achilles and the tortoise in the race and to see who like wins the game, right? So as you know, when you put tortoise ahead start and then you put Achilles back, the donut size, even if actually Toronto is very slow, and if you give a head start for the tortoise, then the Achilles will never catch up, right? So we try to frame that is actually in reality it will not be possible, right? You can solve that in different ways using different mathematics or physics rules, right? But we want to align this paradox with the low resource and high resource research nowadays because recently when we see the development of research, especially in the area of lower source languages, most of the researchers, including us, when I say myself also, I'm also part of the research community, right? So most of the people trying to catch up with whatever done for high resource languages, right? So if there is something built for English, then the other research community try to build a similar thing for low resource languages. And let's say, for example, if you take machine translation, one of NLP applications, so now we have a bunch of machine translation application for higher resource language, like for say, let's say for that translates from English to Spanish. And when it comes to lower source language, maybe you will not find a lot of machine translation applications, right? So one of the things most researchers trying to do is building that kind of application for lower source language, right? So they have a lot of other factors that can contribute to the performance of that machine translation. But the time when we develop machine translation for lower source languages, then the developing machine translation application for higher source language, let's say from English to Spanish, will not stop there, right? They will improve a lot.
Right.
And so it's kind of trying to catch up with whatever done for higher source language. So we are saying, no, this is not the right way to do because in this we will lose a lot of things and we will never reach to the place where higher source languages nowadays are doing, right? So the research for higher source language will never wait until we reach to their place for lower source languages. So we need to find a better way to conduct research for, especially for lower source language that helps the community who speaks that language. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So one of the things you state in the paper is that I'm going to read a little bit. Having a clear definition of low resource would help discern whether technologies built for these languages truly address the needs of the communities who speak them, or if they are built simply on the premise that, kind of like what you're saying, that the same tech exists for higher resource languages. I guess I'm curious here, and what is your opinion on the responsibility of the technology community, like the researchers and the builders, to create the technology, and then where does that end and the responsibility of entrepreneurship and businesses that are like using the technology to solve a specific need begin?
Yeah, so yeah, thank you for the question. When we came to lower resource scenario in general, the trend we are seeing is, yeah, as you said, it's really if we define lower resource very clearly for the research community or for anyone who is interested in working on this language, it will help to track the development of the technology in these languages. And mainly, and also it also helps us to understand if the technology we build as a research community or for commercial purpose even help us really or solves the need of the community. So nowadays, when we see the development of this different technology for different languages, I don't think most of us, when I say us, I mean our researchers, will not take account the problem or the priority or the need of the community. And I believe that it's very important to go there and see what really the community needs rather than just publishing a paper, because as a researcher or as a scientist, obviously we need publication, that's true. But whatever we publish should be something that helps the community, right? So if I'm working on
Mhm.
Amharic, for example, my native language, so instead of like, let's say, as example, developing LLMs for Amharic, I have to know first what the community or the speaker needs. Do really they need LLM now, or they really need something else that can be solved first than building LLM? So if we really care about the community, or if we really care about the language speaker, we need to know first what they really need. And then if we can solve first based on their priority and the problem existing in that scenario, then that really need is to help or to lift the language from, under development or left behind from the technology. So that is the main idea when we add that statement in our paper.
Right. Okay, that makes sense to me. So fit for purpose research rather than just developing technology for the sake of developing technology. Okay, so getting into the paper, your research reveals different aspects of resourcedness. And you do this by boiling down, I think, 868 papers. You end up with 150 papers that you actually performed the analysis on, all of them published between 2017 and 2023, just to set the context. And you end up with these four categories: socio-political, kind of economic, investment, resources, which is sort of defined as the digital access to digital devices, artifacts, agency. This is largely what the paper is about, but give us an overview of how you kind of ended up with those four categories.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So as you said, we started reviewing all the papers that are published from 2017 to current year. And we had some criteria of selecting papers from different conferences, and we mainly targeted NLP conferences, like mainly known NLP conferences, as well as speech conferences, and we collected publication from those conferences. And when we collect, mainly what we did is we search for the term lower resource or under resource in abstract or in the title, and we collect all the paper that have at least lower resource in their title or in their abstract. So
Mhm.
when doing that, removing like a bunch of duplicates, we end up with having around 846 papers. And we initially tried to label those papers manually into three categories first. And when we label, what we found in the paper is they say lower resource, but a couple of the papers, they don't really work on lower resource. So we found like papers that propose a method that works well in lower resource, but when they do experiment or when they want to prove their method works, they use high resource language as a simulation, right? So let's
Mhm.
say they use English and then they try to say from English data, they use like half or one-fourth of the data to show like small amount of data and to prove their system. And we're not interested on those kind of researches. So we try to filter like the real papers that works on lower resource languages. So we did like initial filtering, and when we do filtering, we end up with three different kind of papers. So one category is the paper that uses the term lower resource, but it's not associated with the language, but mostly associated with the task and also domain. So for example, we found a paper that says English is even a lower resource based on the specific tasks, because they couldn't find the data for that specific task or domain, they say hills or something like that. So we are not interested in that kind of category. The second one is the simulation papers, which says they try to prove their method works in lower resource, but they use an experiment, not the lower resource languages, but they try to use high resource language like Spanish, French, or English as a simulation for lower resource languages. And the third category was the actual lower resource language paper. So we try to filter those papers and initial annotation. Then after filtering, we end up with around 65% of the papers that talks about actual lower resource languages. So it's a really huge paper, so we cannot manually go through all the papers. So what
Right.
we did is we randomly sampled 150 papers to actually go through all the write-ups, why they say that language is low resource, what's the criteria to categorize that specific language as low resource. So after labeling a lot of these 150 papers, we found around 4 interconnected themes that contributes to this low resourcedness of one language. So these are mainly, there is agency, there is socio-political related cluster, there is a resource, and the final one is artifacts. And inside these topics, there are also subcategories. For example, if we look at socio-political, there is economic related issues that contribute to the low resourcefulness of a language, and also there is colonial or political related issues that contribute to language. For example, if we take a look at one specific thing for, let's say, economics. So if a community does not have fund to curate the data or to pay for the annotators, then you will end up with not having a data for that specific application for a language. So that's really related to the economic situation. And when we look at the colonial or political era, then nowadays, after the colonization, then when you go to most of the countries or that are colonized during 90s, then you will see like a lot of languages are disappeared that are spoken, or indigenous languages have disappeared, or most of the primary languages or recognized language is high resource language. For example, if you go to Kenya, that's a neighbor to Ethiopia, their main language is Swahili and English, but English is not actually their language, right? So they force it to learn that language due to the colonial era. And when you force someone to learn other language, then you will end up with losing your own languages. So that's also contributes to, what would be spoken and what would be spoken in the school, or what would be printed in the presses, or what would be used in the different social political activities in the country. So that also affects, availability of data. So if people does not use that language in the school, then that means you will not have books written in that specific language. If you don't have books, then you will not find any written material in that language. Then that really means you will not find any data for that specific language. So these 4 different teams are interrelated. And one depends on the other, and they all contribute to one language to be low resource or high resource. This is based on actually extracting information from these 150 papers we randomly sampled from our large 540 papers we reviewed.
Right. Okay. And this connects to the table you include. I'll show it. So you come up with 3 categories: the left behinds, the scraping bys, and the hopefuls.
Okay, thank you so much. So actually, this is not our category. The 3
Okay.
teams are mainly, we took this classification from the publication published by around 2020 by Josh and et al. So as in the introduction, I said most of the people use that paper as a reference to define language as a low resource, right? In that paper, what they did is they classified the world language into 5 classes based on the availability of data. So this class 0, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, there are like 5 categories in their paper. And here we try to show, based on if we categorize a language based on only data availability, then that will not be the right way to do so, because we try to show this like not conflicting kind of behaviors within the language. For example, in class 0, the left behind this is the naming they give in their paper. It's not our naming. So in the class 0, it's from the Joshi and the Ital paper. So in class 0, they said the class 0 means the left behind this, then the scrapping bias, then they continue like that. So here we're trying to like show 2 languages that belongs to the same class based on the Joshi and the Ital paper, but have different, categories based on different factors. For example, we try to see 2 languages in class 0 from Kenya, that's spoken in Kenya, as well as in Australia. So the language spoken in Kenya is Numa Guhoni. And when it comes to Kenya, as I said, Kiswahili and English are the official language in Kenya. But when we see this language, it's not supported in the education system. So that means you will not find any publication, any book related things in this language. But when we come to the language that belongs to the same class based on Josh and Ital paper, which is spoken in Australia, which is called Walpuri. In Australia, there is no official language. And when we see this specific language, it's supported in education system. That means you have at least books, right, in this
Hmm.
language. How you can compare these two languages and how you'd say this language belongs to the same class. So let's say just if you take a look at the education system, so one language supported in education system, but the other is not supported, right? So that means at least for one language, you would find at least hard copy of material like
Right.
books and etc. Right? So at least you have an option to have a data for one language, but for the other one, you don't have any options to get the data, right? So how are we gonna put these two languages just by using at least this one criteria, the same group? So our claim is no, this is not the right way to categorize a language. If we are categorizing a language, I think it would be nice if we take a look at different factors that contributes to our source, just not the data. We recommended the other table page around in table 2, we suggested 3 different aspects in the subdivisions or terminologies to use if we are working on lower source languages. So here clearly we try to split aspects as well as terminology to use when we work on lower source languages as a recommendation for the research community. Yes.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that I misunderstood that, because my next question was going to be asking about some of these inconsistencies that I didn't understand why they belonged in these certain categories. Go into it a little bit. Cherokee, which is in that middle category, versus Warlpiri, which is in the class 0, is in the table. They have relatively the similar number of speakers, but the Cherokee is endangered. Warlpiri is actually stable, but there's machine translation, automatic speech recognition for Cherokee, but then not for. The only thing that seemed consistent and maybe made sense to me, which I'd like to get your thoughts on, is the number of speakers, at least in the table. Do you see in your research, at least, maybe outside of this table, that the number of speakers is a strong indicator of resourcedness, or not necessarily?
Thank you for bringing this question. Yeah, so here also, yeah, we also agreed with my point earlier
Okay,
because
yeah.
we also figure out this is not the right way because you will see a lot of disparities between different
Hmm.
categories. And we try to show the community, look, this is not the right way to do because if you will see like different languages that belong to the same category have different kind of, properties, right? So language speaker, as a researcher, I see this in different perspective, right? So if a language is endangered and if a language is stable, then that's also contributes to the development or the different technologies in that language because like even if you don't have data for let's say for a language, then still you can curate the data if there is a language speaker, right? At least if
Right.
the language is even not written or if there is no script for language, there are a lot of languages that don't have like writer script, right? So but you can collect at least speech data. But if there is no language speaker, then there is no way you can collect
Right.
the data. So that's really language speaker or number of language speaker also matters also, and also affects the availability of data in one way or another. So I believe that's also one of the factor. That's why we try to show different properties, including number of speaker, vitality of the information, digital access of that specific language, linguistic property, and also technologies that developed for that language as different factors that might contribute to the lower sourceness of a language.
How much of this problem, in your opinion, is the result of assimilation via globalization? And what role do you think having this type of a technology available in these different languages could combat sort of the decline in the use of them?
It's really difficult to quantify, like the impact, because it needs research, right, to see what kind of impact really had this colonization era or the current globalization on the language speakers of different languages. But in general, as normally a person who speaks different language as well as a person who had different chance to communicate with different community and also language speakers as well as different researchers, I would say we are seeing a lot of impact of this globalization as well as colonization. era on the availability of data and also technology, and also this really directly impacts the language speakers. So, for example,
Mhm.
the easiest example we could use is, let's say nowadays we have a lot of LLMs that are developed for higher source languages, especially if we take a look at ChatGPT. So most of the ChatGPT thing is very well in English or higher source languages. And if we don't develop something that is really perform well like ChatGPT in Amharic, then what would be the use case for the Amharic speakers? And they will definitely shift from using Amharic related
Right.
thing into English, right?
Right.
So
Right.
technically, we are forcing them to use English. And at the end of the day,
Hmm.
not in 1 year or 2 year, but at the end of the day, then you will end up with people who are using other language than their own language. So that really impacts, the development in that specific language. So as I said, it's difficult to quantify. It needs a lot of research to see the impact. But we can see, like I would say, there will be long-term impact on the specific languages, especially we are not able to develop the same kind of technology that helps the community in their own languages, then we will end up with forced to use the technology that developed for someone else.
Okay. All right. And so my last question for this paper, can you give us an example of, I know you mentioned table two as sort of the suggestion that the paper provides for researchers, but can you give us an example of the kind of terminology you'd like to see when discussing low resource languages in future papers?
When we started the research, we said that the term even lower resources overlooked,
Hmm.
and we want the researchers who are interested in working low resource to use the terminology low resource actually, but it should be explicitly defined what kind of things are missing or contributes to that language to be low resource, right? So if I work on Amharic and if I say Amharic is low resource, instead of saying just Amharic is low resource, because if you just simply say Amharic is lower source, it does not show any implication why you are saying that language is lower source. And
Right.
if you are just simply saying Amharic is lower source, then what would be the other researchers will expect to do, like to fill that gap? So we say, if you are using that terminology, it's okay to say lower source, but you have to explicitly define why you are saying that language lower source. So if I say Amharic is lower source because I cannot find or we couldn't find a parallel data for machine translation, then that really clearly shows why I'm saying Amharic is lower source. So the next researcher or whoever is interested in doing research in this space would look for collecting more data for that specific scenario, right? So here I'm pointing
Right.
the problem as well. If we mention these things, then that's clearly suggests this, other researchers to fill the gaps. They can do whatever, collecting data or curating a lot of things for that language. So we believe that will lift the language.
Right. So as well as explicitly defining the problem space, it provides an avenue for future work potentially from other researchers.
Exactly.
All right. So now going into InkubaML, it's a small language model for African languages. Tell us what inspired that work.
Yeah, that's also related to the current paper motivation. So in the world, there are around 7,000 language spoken, right? But when we see the development of technology in different languages, you will find small languages are present, but most of the languages are left behind. And specifically, the language spoken in global south are left behind from development of this technology, especially in the space of AI nowadays. So AI is now, a lot of people are giving attention to AI, and this language are left behind from development of this technology. And when we see why most of the languages are left behind, obviously there are a lot of contributing factors. One of them is data, obviously, and
Right.
also data is not only the only option, but also to train these language models, you need also compute. And when we see global south, this also scarcity of these specific computers to train these models. If we white big tech companies to build this technology for us, then still we end up with, missing a lot of linguistic property, cultural nuance of that language, because whoever develops that language from outside will not understand, the community needs, the priorities, as well as the cultural related things of that language. So we tried to see if we can build, when we start Incuba project, we wanted to see if we can build something from scratch by using the data we have. Obviously, we know these big models or language models need a lot of data to train and to reach to the same performance level as the current models. But we want to see if we can train a model with the data we have. At least we select a couple of languages. We believe that we can find data easily to see if we can do that first. So to train a model that works with having the data we have and also the compute we have.
At the beginning of the paper, you mention several other, and you mentioned it just earlier in this conversation, other small language models, Tiny Llama, I think you mentioned in the paper, Gemma, some other ones. How does InkubaLM compare to these? What's unique about your approach?
Okay, so in the first, we focused mainly on African languages. In fact, we also included English and the French because those two languages are mostly spoken in Africa, right? But our main target is training a model that can understand languages spoken in Africa, like Swahili, Zulu, and a couple of languages we included. So the difference is when we train a model, our focus is mainly in African languages, but other language models like TinyLM or Gemma, obviously they mainly focus on higher source language that English, right? So when we compare the performance, our language mostly perform well than those language models in our language or in different application when we compare our language model. So the main difference is the priority and the objective. So the objective of InkubaLM is training something works in African languages, the language we selected mainly, and the objective of others is mainly focus on high resource language. So that's the big difference, right? So we use a lot of African language data than English and the French. Even if we included English and the French, we didn't use a lot of data. Obviously, we know there are a lot of data for those languages, but we only use a couple of data when compared to the African languages, because we just want to focus on mainly on improving the performance of African language than English.
And you compare the empirical performance, which is it's in the paper, but you compare InkubaLM to I think 5 or 6 other models, and most of them, that maybe I'm generalizing a little bit, but most of them are quite a bit bigger too, even though they're small language models, and it's still
Yes,
reaching
yes,
performs better than some of these models in these African languages.
yes. Yes,
Okay.
so yeah, this is the initial work, as I said, and we try to see the possibility of developing a small model with small data and with small compute as well to see if we
Right.
can uh, create something that would be comparable with big models. And to show this, we try to compare starting from the data we use. So we try when we trained in InkubaLM, we used a small amount of data compared to other 5 or 6 language models, and also we try to see like compare with small language models that are available currently in and the state-of-the-art models, as well as big models at least, because the idea is, can we create something small that's comparable with big when it comes to
Right.
performance as well? So that's why we included different variety of models that are very well known from Google, Meta, as well as from different companies like Hugging Face and etc. So we believe this is something that would be helpful for the community, especially. So that shows still you can train something that works well with whatever you have. That really suggests you can develop without waiting for someone or big companies to develop something for your languages. Yeah.
Okay, and like you mentioned, this is a first step. What are I guess twofold. What are some of the limitations? Obviously, as a first step, there will be some. And then what's the future work?
Thank you. Yeah. So the limitation is, as I said, this is the first try, we could say. So we just wanted to see if it works, and it turned out it was working, right? So in the first try, we just focus on the couple of languages. So it's just 5 languages, and in Africa, there are a lot of languages. So in the future, we want to expand to a lot of languages. as well. That's the one of our priority. And the second is when we train this model, we just train the base model. So when it comes to LLMs, there are two type of models. There is a base model that is just trained using monolingual dataset without having any task-related dataset. So you can again use that model and fine-tune for specific scenarios. So we didn't do that fine-tuning. I think nowadays communities doing a lot of fine-tuning. We saw a lot of models published into Hugging Face that is used our InkubaLM. We didn't explore or evaluate those models, but communities doing that currently. So that is really something we wanted to see from the community side, and we didn't fine-tune the model, and because of the different factors like compute and the time at the time. So we want to probably in the future we will expand the models to different languages. That's the first priority, and the second one is we will also create specialized model that can handle different tasks, because this base model is not trained to do anything. It's just next token prediction model. It can just simply predict a token or a word if you give a couple of words to the model. So that means you can fine-tune this model or retrain this model to do different tasks like machine translation, classification, chatbot, and etc. So in the future, we will expand the model to do this application-related or downstream task-related works.
Okay, that's exciting. Just out of curiosity, how could a model be trained for to handle code switching? Like, how would that work?
Yeah, so code switching is also one of the challenge when we are working on NLP related things, and it's very common, especially in African scenario. For example, in Kenya or in Ethiopia also, or when you go to South Africa, usually people tend to switch from one language to another, or even within the sentence, they, include different
Switching.
languages. Yeah, they switch between languages. And it's really one of the hard challenge in NLP nowadays. And
Yeah.
I believe there is not a lot of works in this space. When it comes to African language in general, I think there are a couple of works in Chinese, Arabic. Nowadays, a lot of people are working on Arabic because Arabic also is a dialect language, right? There is around 7 or 8 dialects in Arabic itself. And there
Hmm.
are, I know, a lot of efforts, especially I spent a couple of months in Abu Dhabi in the MBZ University, and there are a lot of people who are working on specifically on Arabic, especially related to code switching. And also it's true in Africa, and I don't think there are a lot of works in African scenario. And I believe when training these language models, I think it would be nice to include this code switching property of one language, because that's also how people currently use in their daily activity, right? So I think in the future, one of our priority, apart from expanding to different languages and also training a specific language model that can do some downstream tasks like machine translation, etc., we would also focus on more cultural nuances as well as code switching capability of a language model.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, who should read this paper?
I would say anyone. So, like for example, InkubaLM is mainly focusing on African language, but also we believe it would be helpful for other languages that are spoken in Global South, right? Because the way we did or the way we trained the model would be helpful for the community or researchers who are interested in developing their own language model for their community with having a small amount of compute as well as data. So I believe it would be helpful for anyone who is interested on lower source languages. Not only also in InkubaLM, but also the Zeno's paradox paper. I believe it would be helpful for the researchers who are focusing on general our source languages. And I believe there are a lot of researchers nowadays working on this space. And I hope they would get a lot of insights from our two papers.
All right. And last question. So you're working on Incuba LM still. Anything exciting coming up for you? Any research coming out that we have to look forward to? I know Zeno's paradox just is very recent, but yeah, what's coming up for you next?
Yeah, so There are a couple of projects I'm involved with, and hopefully they will be released soon. And currently, we put one of our paper recently on archive, and that is Proverb Eval. And in that paper, we tried to create a benchmark dataset. Obviously, when you train a language model, you need also benchmark dataset to evaluate the performance of the model. That's also one of the factor or one of the issue we are having when we are working with large source languages. You can train a model with the data available, but when you come to test the model, you don't have that specific data set to test the performance of the
Right.
model. So creating a benchmark data set to test the performance of the model is one of the, I think, priority for people who are working on this language. And I collaborated with a lot of researchers, including Masakane. We tried to develop a lot of benchmark data set for African languages. And recently, in our recent paper in Proverb Eval, we tried to create a benchmark data set to evaluate large language models in Ethiopian languages and for Ethiopian language mainly. And what we wanted to see from those languages how they can understand proverbs, especially proverbs, as you know,
Mm.
they are commonly or widely used kind of sayings in a community, right? And the way you use those proverbs within the community also depends on the speakers and the community. And they are, we believe, they are something related to culture as well. And we try to see how those language models understand these proverbs that are specific to one community or one language, right? To see if those models understand the cultural nuance or cultural related things of that language. So we created this benchmark data set and we evaluated existing models, big models, including Gemma, Llama, and etc., to see how they perform in this benchmark dataset. So that would be also, I think, helpful for the community to see. And there are also currently ongoing projects, and I'm nowadays mostly interested on working on cultural related and low resource and also training these large language models or these languages that are spoken in global south. So hopefully there would be a lot of research papers coming soon in next year.
A lot to look forward to, I guess. Um,
Yeah.
so thank you, Atnafu, again for joining us and sharing with us more about this important and exciting work. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alison, for having me, and it's really great to be here.